Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode. Today, we are unpacking Bangladesh's February 12 elections and referendum, a moment that handed power to a familiar political party while simultaneously mandating structural reform. The central question is whether a status quo political force can carry forward an agenda born out of an anti-establishment protest, and what this means for Bangladesh's democratic trajectory. I am joined today by Professor Asif Shahan, based at the Department of Development Studies in Dhaka University and a senior research fellow at the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. He will help us make sense of this moment and what comes next. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Shahan.
Uh, Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to the podcast.
So the election delivered a clear parliamentary majority to the BNP, which is an
Right,
established and a status quo political party. But the
right.
referendum simultaneously has raised expectations for deep institutional reforms. So do you see this as a moment of genuine transformation or a recalibration of the existing political order under new leadership?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. Uh, the election result kind of reflects the dilemma that the people of Bangladesh were facing throughout the interim government's time. At one end, they were not necessarily sure about the interim government's performance in terms of its, they were looking for a certainty, and that certainty was not necessarily being provided by the interim government. But on the other hand, even when they were looking for certainty, they did not necessarily give up their aspiration for structural changes, the reform aspirations. Back in July 2025, we did a study from BRAC Institute of Governance and Development when we asked people about their aspiration. It's interesting that about around 51% of the respondents were still looking for a key change, fundamental changes in the political system of the country. But at the same time, they're also looking for an election, a transition to power. I think this election, to some extent, reflects that. At one end, people were looking for a steady hand, and which was being offered by Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, and people were voting for them because they were probably not necessarily satisfied with the vision that the other alliance was providing, and they're not necessarily sure about their governing capacity. But on the other hand, the overwhelming response of the referendum, if you look into that, it's more than two-thirds, majority of the casted votes. People were also reflecting their change for genuine political transformation. So I think if you look into that, people have spoken in terms of the one transformation, but at the same time, the ones are kind of a certainty and stability. I think that is it. Now, whether we will go there, to a large extent, it will depend on the party that is coming to power. BNP, whereas they were quite not necessarily on board about the reforms, but we should also remember that when the referendum questions were framed, when there was a call for referendum, BNP did not reject that call. And the BNP's top leadership actually asked their activists to campaign for yes. But now we are seeing that they're trying to kind of backtrack from their promise. And I don't necessarily think that will work well with the party because, as I said, that, people were more than interested in political transformation. So whether we will have it, it will, to a large extent, it will depend on what BNP chooses. Just to give you a perspective that, as per the referendum, we were supposed to have a constituent assembly. And the next parliament should have a dual role. It will at one end perform as a constituent assembly and also as a regular parliament. BNP has taken the oath for the parliament, but did not take the oath for the constituent assembly. So they say that they will make the necessary changes within the constitution, try to incorporate the constituent assembly within the constitution, and then see that whether they can have a constituent assembly. So it is not necessarily well received by the opposition parties. It's not. So there is kind of and a concern and uncertainty going on whether BNP will essentially go for the transformation. I think within the last few days, within the next few days, we will get a clear sense of that. If BNP decided to go with their wishes and try to do things their way and eventually try to ignore the outcome of the referendum, I don't think we will see a major political transformation, which will again may bring us back to the experience of the earlier democratic transition that we had in the 90s. But if BNP decided to compromise and find some sort of a middle ground to deal with that, we will probably be witnessing a lot of changes within the political scenario. So to be honest with you, it all depends on what BNP takes. But as I said, that people's verdict to me is very clear. It's a balance between stability and transformation. They want transformation, but at the same time, they want a kind of a steady hand to govern the country.
Right. And within this context of transition, what do
Mhm.
you think will be the early indicators that this transition is producing real institutional change rather than a return to familiar political patterns?
I think the key thing is, again, I mean, when we are talking about about reform, I mean, the idea was we cannot rely on the goodwill or kind of a the intention of an individual or a party to bring about systematic changes within the political structure. We need change in the design, because our constitution as it stands right now, it clearly allows extensive power to the executive, to the one party that comes into power, or to the one individual who assumes the role of the prime minister. So we need those changes. So I think the clear indication that we can see that once BNP started implementing the reforms, what they're planning to do. For instance, in Bangladesh, as per the referendum, since the referendum has passed, there is a provision of having an upper chamber where the members will be elected through proportional representation, and the upper chamber will have one significant role. That is that in case of constitutional amendment, a simple majority of the upper chamber will be required. So now BNP agreed with the upper chamber, but they did not agree with proportional representation. Electing members in proportion to the votes that they received in the lower chamber. They actually argued in favor of having members elected in proportion to the number of seats owned in the lower chamber, not proportion of votes, but the number of seats. And they did not agree with the constitutional amendment rule. And they made it clear in their manifesto. So a clear indication is when the reform process started, what will BNP do? Because there is, if you look into the referendum result, people have given a clear verdict in terms of upper house and proportional representation and constitutional amendment. So whether BNP will go with the referendum result, or if they decide, okay, let's forget about referendum, this is how we want to do things. And this is how we want to do things is a critical factor to consider. Because if BNP takes that certain step in case of reform, then I'm guessing that they will take the similar step in case of ensuring the independence of the constitutional bodies, the institutions of accountability, whether they will allow the opposition's participation in selecting the chair and members of the constitutional bodies, or whether they will rely on the prime minister or the executive to make decisions about appointing people within those institutional bodies. I think we will get a clear reflection of that. If BNP for some reason does not necessarily focus on those specific checks and balances, empowering the institutions of accountability, ensuring that the parliament does not necessarily become a rubber stamp for the executive, we will get a clear signal that things are not necessarily changing. We are once again relying on the goodwill of or intention of one individual. On the other hand, if they decide to introduce changes, which will allow the opposition to participate in the parliamentary process or empower the opposition to hold the executive accountable, I think that will show us a clear indication that things are moving in the right direction. So we have to see what the party decides to do.
Right. Another important element here is representation, which
Yeah.
remains uneven, particularly for
Hmm.
women and minority communities. So,
Right.
what do you think the election results tell us about the structural limits of political inclusion in Bangladesh, even at
Mhm.
this moment which is framed as a democratic renewal?
No, I think you're absolutely right. If you look into the representation, I think we have only 6 or 7 women elected as members of the parliament, and that is kind of a historical low. I mean, that is probably one of the lowest that we ever have in the history of Bangladesh, and that's very alarming, considering the fact that if you look into the July uprising, the women leaders, the female students, they played the most important role. They played a very significant role, and women eventually have been sidelined through by the political parties throughout these 18 months, but the ruled by the interim government. And at the same time, the trouble is, when there was the question of nominating women candidates, all the major political parties fell short. Jamaat Islami, which led the opposition alliance, they did not even nominate one single woman, even though in the July Charter there was a provision that they have to nominate at least 5% women candidates. BNP did nominate some, but those nominations were not even up to 5%. 5% is a pretty low number, considering the fact that around 50 to 51% of the voters are women. If you cannot even nominate 5% of the women within the parliament, that tells you something about the political parties, and that's very alarming. And even we have seen that in most cases the parties have not necessarily made efforts or attempts to ensure women's participation in the political process. If you look into the representation of people's order in Bangladesh, there is a provision that women, at least 33% of the central committee members should be women. But unfortunately, if you look into the central committee members of the political parties, the number right now is below 10% for most of the parties. So they have not done anything about it, and they have not necessarily allowed women's representation. So that's very alarming, and that is something that I think will create a lot of problem for us in the future in terms of ensuring representation. And that is also true for representation of the minorities, the religious minorities, the ethnic minorities. We have not necessarily made much progress there. And if you look into the ministries, the ministries that have been set up by BNP after coming into power, you can also see that there is serious lack of representation of women, ethnic minorities, and religious minorities. They have not necessarily gained enough important positions within the parliament. So I think if you think about inclusion, and if you think about the spirit of the July uprising, which talked a lot about inclusivity, we have remained far behind, and I think the political parties must take responsibility for that. And I also would think that the civil society organizations in Bangladesh over the next 3-4 years will start raising voices about that, because essentially, if you look into the reform process, the entire discussion was led by, I would say, Bengali Muslim male. So that does not necessarily, present a picture of a country that wants to be inclusive. So how can we ensure the representation of these different groups will eventually determine what type of Bangladesh we want to see, in future.
And what we're also now seeing is a more fragmented political landscape in Bangladesh with youth-driven actors and religious
Mhm.
groups and traditional political parties all competing for space. So
Right.
how might this reshape the way politics is negotiated and contested over the next few years, you think?
Again, that's a very important question for Bangladesh. I mean, if you look into the election result, it seems like, okay, BNP has an overwhelming majority. But if you just try to sort of get a deep dive into data, the situation is much more complicated. It's not necessarily simply says that it's a very easy win for BNP. We are observing a fragmented country. We are not necessarily sure about the whole picture right now because we are still crunching data to understand what's happening in different parts of country. As data is coming up, our understanding of the whole election scenario is changing. But let me just talk to you about what we have understood so far. What we have seen that in the northern part of the country and specifically close to the border areas, Jamaat has done extensively well. In divisions like Khulna, they have done extensively well. They have done well in Rangpur. All of those are, kind of the northern and border part of the countries. And in Rajshahi, they have done really, really well. And in all of those cases, Jamaat's that 68 parliamentary seats that they have won have mostly come from those areas. In the other divisions of the countries, they have not necessarily done well. So there has been a change there. I mean, because these particular regions, some of them were Jamaat's stronghold traditionally, but some of them were BNP stronghold. So some of the BNP stronghold have actually changed hands, have went from BNP to Jamaat, and we had another political party, Jatiya Party, which was a big force in Rangpur division. That political party has almost disappeared, and it looks like Jamaat Islami has taken the complete control over that particular place. So that's very important that how the regional priority of Bangladesh is changing, considering what has happened. At the same time, there is a pretty good possibility. We have not necessarily crunched all the data here, but it looks like that women have not necessarily been rejected by Jamaat. So there is a newspaper, there is a news organization, Netra News, which has done relatively well in covering election and other news. They have showed an interesting trend. They have done a study on 116 election centers or election booths where only women were allowed to vote. I mean, the election centers are divided sometimes according to gender. Some election centers are only for male voters, some election centers are only for women voters. So they choose 116 women centers and have seen that in most of the cases where in the women centers, in most of the cases where Jamaat has won, the women centers have voted for Jamaat. So it looks like Jamaat's vote among the women have played a significant role, and that has happened even though we have seen the Jamaat leaders talking about women's rights in a negative way, women's empowerment and employment opportunities in a negative way. So that has happened despite that. So we need to understand what's happening there. So, and as a result of that, if women vote is actually shifting to Jamaat, if that becomes a larger trend, as I'm saying that we are still crunching the data to understand what really happened. So that is kind of tell you a very interesting story. On the other hand, the youth vote, if you look into Dhaka city's election result is very interesting because Dhaka metropolitan area usually have 15 seats. And in the history of Bangladesh, whenever a party has won in the election, in almost all cases, they have owned all the seats in the Dhaka metropolitan areas, except for in 1996, one seat went to BNP, even though Awami League owned the national election. But this time, out of the 15 metropolitan seats, 8 went to BNP and 7 went to Jamaat. So Jamaat made a big stride in Dhaka, and that's really, really interesting that they have done so well in a Dhaka metropolitan area where we kind of think it's a more thought leaders and university students, the youth, they are living in Dhaka, and a large part of them have eventually decided to vote for Jamaat. Jamaat has done well in Gazipur, a suburb close to Dhaka. Jamaat has done well in Narayanganj, which is again a suburb close to Dhaka. And this is interesting. So what's happening here? Does that mean that a significant part of youth voters have actually shifted from BNP and decided to vote for Jamaat? So that is another fragmentation that we need to look into. And there's also a possibility, as I was saying, that the urban Gen Z or urban youth population is probably broken more for Jamaat but the rural youth population and the rural Gen Z has probably voted more for BNP. So we haven't seen, haven't crunched the data yet. But if that happens, and there's a strong possibility of that happening, given that in those places BNP has largely won, so that told you that even within the youth groups there are significant variation, there are significant fragmentation, their aspiration and idea, everything differs, and the political landscape needs to take that under consideration. And the other fact is the Awami League votes. There is a newspaper report which shows that in the places where Awami League did always have done well in the past, BNP has actually done quite well in there. So that means Awami League votes have really shifted to BNP. On the other hand, in some BNP strongholds, Jamaat has done reasonably well. That means some of BNP's vote is kind of shifting to Jamaat. So are we observing a realignment? We don't necessarily know, because some of the Awami League voters were forced to make a choice this time, and they decided to choose BNP. But whether that will become a larger trend, we need to wait a little bit and see. But these are all sort of indicating a fragmented country where essentially voters' opinion differed a lot. And as we know that there are around 40 to 50 seats where election results were very, very close. Majority of them went for BNP, but if it could go other way, things could have been much more complicated. So, I mean, when we talk about the overwhelming majority of BNP, we should also remember all of this caveat and nuances. And if we consider this caveat and nuances, as you said, that it tells us about a much more complicated story. It tells us about a much more fragmented country where the political landscape is becoming really, really competitive, where all of those forces are trying to find their place within the political domain.
Correct. I think those are very important and interesting insights, and
Mhm.
as more data flows through, this will be very
Absolutely.
interesting to study as well. I'll
Absolutely.
I'll move to my final question now, which also looks at an important area for the new government. In
Mhm.
your opinion, what do you think is the most immediate foreign policy test for the new government?
I think in terms of foreign policy, I mean, what will be the relationship of with India of this government? It will be a really, really critical issue. We have seen that in the past there were clear indication from the Indian government that they're not necessarily interested to work with the interim government. And we have also seen some political parties to come up with rhetoric that's not necessarily very helpful to mend the relationship between these two countries. But I think that situation is changing a little bit, as India is showing more and more interest to interact with the government, and the government is also kind of considering the difficulties and the challenges that we face in terms of dealing with our neighbors. But within that relationship, I think a big issue will be what will happen with Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League leaders who are staying in there. Tariq Rahman, the prime minister, has already made it very clear. I think his government made it very clear that they will ask for Hasina's extradition. I really don't see that happening. I don't think that that will happen, since already there is a death penalty hanging over her head. I don't necessarily think that India will be willing to send her back. The question is whether Bangladesh can have a relationship with India with this thing, holding above that hand, above the head. And this is where it's important. If Hasina does not necessarily talk that much or come up with, fiery speeches, and does not necessarily try to create a problem, I think things will eventually come back to, in a normal situation. The good thing is we are kind of have a normalcy in the foreign relations. We are kind of having in a situation where there will be dialogues and discussions. So I think things will eventually cool down. We will have more discussions. So I think things will hopefully will go well.
Thank you, Professor Shant. This was a very insightful conversation, and I'm glad you could join us today for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website, or you can get updates via social media. We are available on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.